Hello, it's Silver. This is Beyond Sunset. So this one actually surprised me a little bit because I was under the impression that this was more of like a pure old school shooter kind of experience, level by level, a lot like Doom. And in fact, it is actually in the GZ Doom engine, but more on that a little bit later. But in fact, this is not your traditional pure shooter and is instead almost like a sort of immersive sim light kind of experience. Like, we're not talking about a full-on Deus Ex style of game here, but it is very clearly inspired by games like that. So we do have some light RPG elements, some light open world elements, and a pretty heavy focus on exploration and gathering money and stuff to upgrade yourself. So the way that it works is you'll start out with a pretty simple idea. Just wake up, kind of figure out the world that you're in, and you're told to go to find this person, and you're just sort of led off on the street in the middle of this sort of cyberpunk city and left to your own devices. And at that point, you start to figure out that just going and waltzing up to this person is probably not going to happen. It's going to be a lot more involved than that. And so you'll sort of organically open yourself up as you explore the world and figure out more of the mechanics and things, and at the same time as you're sort of learning the mechanics of the game, and that it's not just like a traditional straight shooter, but it actually does have some RPG elements and stuff. You'll start to figure out more about the setting itself and what's actually going on, because you'll start getting like side quests and stuff that help to explain a little bit more about the world, and you'll start going to more and more of these side areas to start, getting access keys and unlocking doors and stuff, to the point that you'll learn more about how this world actually works just by exploring around. As for you yourself, you are a street samurai, so you do have that like classic neon-soaked cyberpunk samurai vibe going on, and you are cybernetically enhanced, so you do have some special skills and things that you will unlock as you go. You'll have an infinite ammo energy pistol that can fire a charged shot, although it does actually take quite a while to charge, so you gotta plan in advance a little bit and do a lot of bullet dodging and stuff while you're charging it in order to not get killed. And of course you also have a katana, because of course you do, you sort of need one in a setting like this, and it is just a very powerful melee option, but it's also integrated into gameplay a little bit more than that, because you'll notice you have these sort of purple charges on the bottom left of the screen just above your health gauge, and you can spend these to do this sort of forward dashing slash with the sword. And as well as being a really powerful combat option, it also tends to shower you with health pickups if it kills an enemy, and this is one of the main ways you're actually going to be getting health back, because there are of course health pickups scattered around the arenas and stuff, but there are only so many of them, and some of these battles can go on for quite some time, and also some of them can spill out across like multiple street levels and things where there's a lot more exploration to be done, so you will need a more reliable way to sort of take health kits with you, as it were, and the way to do that is to use this special attack to kill things in order to get a bunch of health as a reward. As you explore the city and unlock more areas, especially behind some of the like key code colored key doors, those sorts of ideas, you'll find some new weapons as well to take along with you. Weapons like an assault rifle and a shotgun. So although a lot of your arsenal is not like crazy cyberpunk futuristic weaponry, it is still pretty fun to use, I think, because this is GZ Doom. You're probably familiar if you've played anything in this sort of engine before. There's a specific feel to the way the shooting works in GZ Doom, and in my opinion it's really satisfying. And they've done a good job of polishing that feeling up in their interpretation of how this engine should work for them, and it means that a lot of your weapons, while being relatively simple thematically, are still really fun to use because they have a lot of satisfying effects. The assault rifle is just an assault rifle, but it also has a tendency to sort of shred through things in a really satisfying way, just because of the way the shooting feels in this game. Rapid fire weapons have this like tearing everything around you apart kind of feel to them, so it's still a really fun weapon to use despite simply being an assault rifle. And the same goes for the shotgun. It is just a shotgun, but I mean, GZ Doom shotguns are usually some of the best out there when it comes to your more old school, like simple engine shotguns. They just work really well, and this one is no exception. It does take enemies apart and tends to jib them very satisfyingly, even from a fair distance. This is one of those cases where it's a shotgun that has a fair bit of range, which I always feel the need to sort of harp on about for a minute whenever I see it, because it's rare in a shooter, especially like a more retro shooter, to have a shotgun that actually is effective beyond like 10 feet. And I think it's always worth mentioning whenever a shotgun is actually usable at a good range, because that tends to make it an even more satisfying weapon to use. And this one does have a really nice sort of drum-fed pumping mechanism that has some nice animation tied to it and stuff too. One thing to also mention is you do have a really good defensive option, because your katana can actually deflect bullets. If you hold the guard button, you can deflect bullets as long as you are at a really good angle, like you're, right in front of them when they hit you so they don't go past your guard, you're able to deflect them. And if you deflect them at just the right time, you can send them straight back to where they came from and actually kill enemies with the deflections. This remains a viable option as far as I can tell for like the whole game, even when there are a lot of enemies on screen at once, because as long as you're able to find a spot where the bullets converge a bunch of them at a time, you can actually deflect all of them in one group as long as you time it right. One thing you will notice when you first get a new weapon is that it has a very low maximum ammo capacity. You can't carry very much ammo in this game. This means you are very reliant on your katana and your energy pistol for a long time, because you'll always have those, and you won't always have ammo for everything else. But one of the things you can do is find some money through exploration, through killing enemies and things, and you can find shops throughout the world and actually buy upgrades from these shops. And one of the upgrades you can buy are increased ammo capacities for each of your weapons. So although they do start off having very low ammo, you will be able to actually up this limit as you go through the game and make them usable more often. And eventually you'll be able to even buy entirely new weapons and some other fancy upgrades and stuff with your money at these shops once you get farther into the game. And you can also buy extra maximum health, which is nice because you do take a lot of damage in this game. I am playing through on hard, so I guess that probably has something to do with it, but it is a game where you can die very quickly, even from full health. Enemies do a lot of damage to you, and you are often in combat scenarios where you are surrounded by large numbers of enemies at once, so your health can be depleted super quickly. You do have a dash as well, and this is pretty important because there's a lot of platforming in this game, I've noticed. There are some sections that are extremely vertical, where you're actually in a relatively linear section of streets and buildings that doesn't have a lot of places to go, but you'll find yourself in these areas for a long time because you'll be going from floor to floor and going through multiple like sky bridges and platforming levels of this singular area that makes it actually have quite a bit of depth to it. Despite being a relatively straightforward area like on the map, you're going to be kind of crossing back and forth between various Z levels of it and unlocking elevators as shortcuts and doing a lot of platforming challenges on little floating platforms and things. There's a lot of platforming, but I do think that because of the way the movement works, it feels pretty accurate. You do sort of skate around, but not to the point where it feels like you're on ice all the time. You're just really fast, but you do have pretty solid control of your character, and I think you have really good air control, which is the important part. Because of the amount of platforming you'll be doing, you do need to feel like, once you leave the ground, you still have a good amount of control as to where you're actually going. And I think you do, and when combined with your dash, which you can use in midair, you can travel a really long distance through the air, although you do have to be a bit careful because the dash can't be like interrupted or stopped early or anything. It does go a specific distance forward, so it's easy to like overshoot platforms if you didn't actually need to dash and you were instead able to reach it just through like a long jump. You may end up just dashing straight over it. Another aspect to the arena design that's a little bit unusual, well really it's very unusual for the genre, is that most of the enemies in this game are not actually present on the levels, and instead they teleport in when battle starts. So you will find enemies roaming around areas, but a lot of the enemies that you'll face will be teleported in after you engage combat with those few enemies that are already there, like 4 times the number of enemies that you saw will spawn in. And this is going to be one of those things that is going to aggravate some people, and other people are going to be okay with it. So this is very much like a your mileage may vary kind of thing, because I know some people are really sensitive to the issue of having a lot of enemies spawning in. They prefer all of their enemies to be on the map already, so you know what you're getting into, and they find it very annoying when you're doing more of like the sort of Serious Sam / Painkiller thing, where like some of the enemies are there, but most of them aren't until battle starts, and then they all teleport in. So that is something I feel the need to mention. Whether or not that's actually something that you enjoy is going to be very much up to you, but I do have to say I think the areas that have enemies already spawned in work better in this game. They have a better sense of atmosphere and a better sense of progression as you go through the areas, because you can see the upcoming encounters already with the enemies spawned in, and usually they're in like clever places, like higher up on platforms that are hard to see, or through windows and various bits of cover and stuff. So there's a good amount of like structure to the combat in those areas where the enemies already are, as opposed to the areas where the enemies just sort of pop in out of thin air. But I will say, even though I'm not as much of a fan of having tons of enemies spawn in, I think the game kind of earns it by having really good arena design. It's not as big of a deal to have enemies spawning in on top of you when the arenas that you're fighting in are actually enjoyable to maneuver through and actually fight within, and large enough to allow you some mobility and stuff to actually get away from the crowds of spawning enemies, and feel like you can stay on top of the crowd by just doing a lot of maneuvering and platforming and dashing around and stuff. So I do think that even though the larger combats where enemies spawn in a lot are a little bit weaker than the larger combats where most of the enemies are already present, that the arena design does go a good distance to sort of smoothing that over and making it not as big of a deal, at least because the areas themselves are actually fun to fight in. As far as the audiovisual experience here goes, it's a pretty good one because it's got that sort of synthwave cyberpunk style, that 90s cyberpunk aesthetic, and it manages to use it pretty well. It's got a good use of like colored sector lighting and things like that, and a lot of lighting from effects like explosions and gunfire that also helps to sort of splash color throughout the areas as you're fighting. And there's a lot of course, like neon colors and very saturated blues and purples and reds and oranges and stuff like that really stand out. And as far as the soundscape goes, it's very much dominated by the music, which is made by Carl Vincent, who is a sort of legendarily good synthwave, vaporwave kind of musician. And just look their stuff up and you'll probably recognize some of it. And they do a really good job here of providing a very fitting soundscape for this sort of plague-ridden city. And that's actually another one of the last things that I wanted to mention is the fact that this is a plague-ridden city, which means that there are some areas of it that are not bright neon shootouts, but are instead much more spooky, atmospheric, slow-paced crawls through like zombie-infested, old, abandoned streets and stuff. And it's really neat that the game manages to have both a really good atmosphere in the sort of upbeat rooftop neon fights and the much more spooky, downtrodden crawls through very creepy atmosphere. It does a good job of having both and actually doing them both pretty well, which I definitely like. And probably the last thing to mention is that since this is GZ Doom, after all, it is very moddable. So this is a game that has a lot of like open source modding tools available for it because it's GZ Doom. It's an engine that a lot of people are familiar with, and you can in fact mod this game right now. So that's exciting because it's always nice to see what people come up with for games like this. Usually they have all sorts of fun additions in mind, like some cool maps and some new weapons and maybe even some new mechanics and things that will sometimes influence what the developers themselves actually add to the game going forward, and other times just serve as a nice cool thing to download and try out when you want. As far as the early access goes, it is a very polished experience so far. You'll find that there's a fair amount of variety and content when it comes to the areas that you can explore and all the different places you can go, but in terms of like weapon variety and stuff, there's still quite a bit of that to be added over time. I think overall the game in its current state is very well worth the $10. That's a pretty low entry price for something that feels this polished and with this much of a nice sort of synthwave atmosphere that does a pretty good job of being this interesting mix between like a straight retro shooter and like a light immersive sim-ish kind of experience. And I think it's got a pretty good future ahead of it if it keeps developing in the direction that it's going. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can go and check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.